Everyone, and welcome back. I think I put up a video yesterday that mentioned doing a transmission teardown. Now, I did a transmission rebuild series quite a while back, actually tearing the transmission down. So I'm not going to film that again. If you go back in my history, probably about 1.5 to 2 years ago, I did a series on a complete rebuild, and I believe it was done as a Jim's Tool Tech Tuesday video back then. And it showed full disassembly of the gear set, installing new bearings and things like that, putting it back together. So if you want to actually see the complete teardown of a gear set, then I would say check back in the history and you'll find that one. The thing that I didn't film was actually removing the transmission from the bike. And that's what we want to do today. We've done a bunch of engine teardown videos, but I haven't really done a transmission teardown video. Actually, I take that back. I did one for Baker, oh man, years ago, probably like 4 or 5 years ago. And things are virtually the same, but it's been a while. Let's do it again. This is on a 2014 Ultra Classic, and it's, of course, a cruise drive transmission that was introduced on all models back in 2007, factory 6-speed. The process for what I'm going to show you today is virtually the same for, all those models, even leading up to current models. And again, it's a 2014 Ultra Classic. As you can see, I've already removed the engine from it, and I've already disassembled the primary entirely. So we're just going to be removing the gear set today. So let's get to it. I like to start with what can be one of the most frustrating things in all this, and that's removing the inner primary bearing race here. This one's actually chewed up quite a bit, so we needed to come in here with this anyway. Now, there was, I believe it was in 2007, there was a bit of a change to the main shaft in the transmissions. If you remember on the earlier models, it wasn't uncommon for this bearing race to actually walk in and get to the point that it was hitting the nut here, right? That made it very difficult to get the tool behind it so you could pull it out. And all too often, folks would damage their tools by trying to slide that horseshoe in there and then beating it in there with a hammer to get the sleeve out far enough so you can get the tool in there. I don't like damaging my tools. So that being said, a little tech tip on this deal, if you find that it's gotten too far, you can take the side cover off on the other side and very lightly tap the main shaft on the opposite side, bringing that shaft out slightly. That can often give you enough room to be able to get the horseshoe behind here, okay? In doing this, heat is your friend. All too often, folks will try to pull these out, and then they end up trying to have to cut them off and do that sort of stuff. I've had to do it myself sometimes in some extreme cases, but this little procedure right here is one way I have found that can make it a little easier. Now, I recommend you have all your tools laid out in front of you because you want to work kind of quick, because we are going to be applying heat. You can do it with a torch, of course, and I would recommend putting a little heat sticker right here so you don't get the base shaft too hot and destroy the seals if this is all you're doing. In this case, we're replacing everything in this transmission anyway, so I say it doesn't matter, but I don't like using a torch if I don't have to. So I use one of these little mini induction heaters here, and the goal is to get this sucker as pretty dang hot. And then again, if I was just changing this, I would want to put a heat sticker on there and not get the shaft over about 200 degrees, 230 give or take. But we're going to heat this up. We're going to put the tool on as quick as we can, and pulling it off should be relatively easy. I do want to spray a little bit of penetrating lubricant in there. And then we'll use our little mini induction heater. All right. Oil on our threads. And of course, don't touch that, it's hot. And that made pretty light work of it. Next, we're going to remove the retainer plate. I'm going to go ahead and warn you guys, these can break. May have to apply a little bit of heat to them, but I'm going to see if I can just work these out slowly. And now we're going to move to what is the other most frustrating thing about doing one of these. And also, right-hand thread on these models. And to make it easy, Motor Company did put right here on the pulley, right-hand thread. Again, to do this, I like to have all my tools in place because we're going to use our little induction heater again. We're going to start with locking our belt pulley. That'll lock our pulley into place. Go ahead and put the guide on the shaft here for your socket. And we'll use the induction heater again. Now, I made this one. You can order lengths of this and then make one to the size that you need. So we're going to heat this up. And we are going to use an impact on this, but we're only going to bump it. You guys will see what I'm talking about here in a second. There you go. It may take a couple of times. It did me to get it hot enough, but it didn't take a tremendous amount of effort. I was barely on the throttle on that impact. Again, we want to preserve our tools and be as least destructive as possible. And keep in mind, this stuff is going to be hot. And from here, we can remove the pulley. It's going to still be a little warm, which is actually good. It can make it slide off that main drive gear a little easier. You'd want to loosen your belt up. Mine's still a little snug. I didn't loosen it up enough, but it's still enough that I can wiggle the belt off just to get the pulley out of the way. And we'll just slide it right off the back for now. All right, now we can remove the main drive gear seal, but I'm going to get the belt out of the way first. You can pull it off of the rear pulley, bring the slack up, and it just makes it real easy to get it out of the way, just like that. I use a 1/4 inch drill bit on this right here, and we're just going to drill a very small hole in this seal. Don't put a lot of pressure on it because you don't want to, punch through to the transmission. All we're doing is breaking through the metal on the seal here. Just like that. Now, we can use a seal puller. Of course, you want to make sure, don't pivot it here on the transmission case either. You don't want to damage that. If you ride it on the seal, you can pop that sucker right out of there, just like that. Ooh, that bearing sounds gritty. Yeah, it was about to lose the main drive gear bearing, which actually isn't highly uncommon. Some of these would fail as early as 30,000 miles, and largely was based on an automatic primary chain tensioner. If you had too much sprocket shaft run out and, hub bearing run out, that sort of thing, could put a lot of tension on the chain and cause premature failure of the main drive gear bearing. And this one certainly sounds crunchy, so it was time. And the next frustrating thing can be removing this clip that holds in the main drive gear bearing. Now, a pair of these. You can get them relatively inexpensive from Blue Point. You can try to fight these snap ring pliers. You can fight it with smaller ones. But I've always found just getting a good set that will ratchet into place and allow you to work that snap ring out of there makes this a heck of a lot easier. Seat it down in there all the way, and then it'll ratchet down and hold, and then you can do a little wiggling. And sometimes it doesn't go the first time. You might have to pry just a little bit on the clip easily to get it dislodged. And then watch your eyes in case this thing pops out, because it can, and they go flying. So we're going to get this out of the way just like so. One other thing I'll show you real quick. So this clip, I have actually torn transmissions apart where this was done incorrectly. Now, when you look at this clip, it's beveled on one side, all right, and then it's flat on the other. All too often I've seen it put in this direction. The correct direction is with this bevel facing out so that it presses it up against the bearing like that. So make sure that bevel is facing out when you reinstall it. Next, we want to remove the shift lever. I like to make a little mark on the shaft just to remind me where it was exactly. Now we can remove this snap ring, the washer, and the seal behind it. And here we're going to do the same thing with the seal here that we did here, but you want to use a really, really tiny drill bit and just barely catch the edge of the seal. Be careful, you do not want to damage either the shaft or the transmission case. And we'll use a pick. And just slide it right into that hole. And again, be very careful not to damage the surfaces around it. And then you just pick this out of there. Like so. All right, next, let's get your dipsticks out of the way. I've actually seen and done it once myself. Forget to pull a dipstick, and then you pull the transmission. You can actually break your dipsticks by doing that. So let's get these out of the way. I also like to just go ahead and go through and just break all the bolts loose. We'll get to the top cover here in just a second. I always like to break them loose by hand because you never know if they're going to be stuck. I want to feel it, and I certainly don't want to put an impact or anything like that on it and rip them out of there. And just like many of the other Foamat gaskets that you'll find on the engine, your cam cover, rocker box, tappet blocks, that sort of thing, these things do stick pretty good sometimes. Never ever pry on them. Sometimes a plastic hammer won't work. All right, you end up having to beat on the thing pretty hard, right? And it still doesn't break loose. The last thing we want to do is to start prying on it. Now, all too often, you can use a steel hammer, and I guess just the shock load of it is just enough to break this loose. But again, you don't want to damage the cover. So put yourself a rag over it. That's going to soften it up a little bit to keep from marring the surface. And typically, just a couple of taps of this might be enough. Oh, and there it went. Broke loose. Now we can go back to our softer hammer. And there she goes. And you can see we did that without doing any damage to the cover whatsoever. All right. peel that gasket off. And to get our shifter pawl out of the way is pretty simple. We're just going to lift it up like this and lay it back here on the back of the transmission. Don't pull up on this too hard because it can bend and deform that pawl spring right there. So we just want to gently lay it right there, and that'll get that off the shift drum. And then from here, we can start removing all of these and our cover. Of course, I've already drained the transmission. We may lose a little bit of fluid here, even though I've done that. And then also, as part of the rebuild, I will be pulling the oil pan and cleaning it out. Remember, we're doing an engine build on this as well, so I want to make sure I've got a good clean oil pan down there. And at this point, I can move to a battery impact. I know I've got all the bolts broken loose. All right, we've got the same challenge here with a stuck gasket. And we're dealing with the same thing. We've tried this hammer, it didn't really work. All we're gonna do is lightly tap it. I didn't put a rag here, he's got a chrome cover over it, but this is aluminum. You have to be very careful with this. The idea is just light taps. If you do 2 or 3 light taps, this should break loose, and you'll hear it when it does. There it goes. Now we can remove our cover. All right. Go ahead and remove the gasket. All right. And now we can get our trap door bolts out. At this point, we can remove the entire gear set. Now, I'm pretty sure this gasket's going to be stuck on this side, just like the rest. But we have the shaft, and this entire cassette is going to roll out of here. All right? So it's certainly not going to move. So now let's see if we can just give it some light taps on the other side with the main shaft to break this loose. Now, one of the things I had mentioned, since we're on this side here, we had talked about the inner primary bearing race and how on the earlier models that do not have the shoulder on the main shaft, how that race can walk in up against the pulley, main drive gear, that sort of thing. And I had mentioned coming to this side, and what you can do, make sure the transmission's in neutral. You can take an impact and actually back this bolt off just a little bit. We're talking a very small amount. And actually, once you pull your shaft out, all right, then you can tap this shaft right here slightly and often create enough room to get the tool on the other side. So that's what I was speaking of there. So I'm going to leave the camera on this side so you guys can see this breaking loose. And again, I'm going to use a saw-faced hammer. And it's that easy. So now we pull the cassette. May have to go a little bit further. Support the weight of it on this side, because once it drops off of the dowel pins, it wants to flop down. So we just want to get it to the point. See how it flopped down there? Now we can walk around. And pull the cassette. And there we go. I didn't realize sorry guys, I didn't realize the camera wasn't running. I haven't taken anything else apart. All I did was install the main drive gear bearing, or excuse me, main drive gear removal tool from Jim's here. And it's a bar, and you can just use the bolts there from the trap door. these bolts don't have to be crazy tight. If you use the stock bolts and try to run them all the way through, you can actually crack the case. It just needs to be 3 or 4 threads in there, no big deal, because you're going to be pulling against this anyway. So the face is going to take the pressure, not the bolts. Now we're back on the other side. I've got a socket ratchet on this side. Don't use impact tools on this stuff, guys. You may have to hold the through bolt on the opposite side while you do this, but it shouldn't take a tremendous amount of effort to get that to start pulling in there. As I get the kickstand out of the way. And now we're back on the other side. We'll remove our wrench. Want to reach in there and hold the main drive gear assembly. Pull our bolt out, and then there's our main drive gear. Of course, the bearing comes with it, and it just pretty much shatters the inside of the bearing. There's a seal right here that often is forgotten, and that seal should certainly be changed if you're doing a rebuild. We're putting a whole new cassette in here with a new main drive gear, so I'm not really concerned about this bearing. If you were doing a basic rebuild, you'd then have to go in with this bearing race here and use a puller on a press and actually get that part of the race off so it would go into the new bearing. And you also have a seal in here that should be replaced, again, if you're just doing a rebuild. So now we can remove our plate and then move to the other side, and with another tool we'll remove the rest of the main drive gear bearing. And one of the things I recommend you doing, remember I'd mentioned that there were some common failures with these main drive gear bearings. Now this part, this inner portion sleeve, it being loose, is not uncommon. Remember, we just pulled this bearing apart when we took the main drive gear out. But it was not uncommon at all for me to see where this bearing actually began to lock up, overheat, and then the outer part of the roller bearing would then begin spinning inside the case. So before you just start putting your tools in here and everything else, grab this bearing and pull on it and see if you've got any wiggle and see if it comes out very easily by hand. If it does, that bearing may have spun inside the case, and unfortunately about the only fix is a new case. Now if it's not too bad, it can be machined. I have done that before, put a sleeve in there. I have to make a sleeve. It's a very costly thing to do. However, in that case, often it's less expensive just to get a transmission case. Another way you can do it is if it's kind of snug, but maybe spun a little bit, you can use a green bearing retainer Loctite, because that version of Loctite will seal gaps quite a bit and keep that from spinning. And that's if you're in that position that you have to do that and a case isn't an option, that's something that you could try. So there's two parts to this tool as well. This goes on the inside. I'm going to try to reach it from this side, just like so. Then you have this outer collar, and then you have a niece bearing, washer, and a nut. And when you're using any puller, be delicate with it. Kind of move it around a little bit before you start snugging stuff up. All right? That keeps it centered, keeps from potentially bending your tool. And it shouldn't take very much effort with this to pull the bearing. And I can feel that it's now out of the case. So can get the rest of our the rest of our tool out of there, and then our bearing should just walk right on out, just like so. And when I do a close inspection of the bearing, I want to look for any galling that's here from being pulled from the aluminum. This can also help me identify if maybe this bearing is spun in the case. And fortunately, I don't see any, but man, that bearing's in rough shape. And then I also want to inspect in this area here, feel for any burrs, and again, look for any galling in this area or damage that could indicate that the bearing spun in there. A couple other things on the disassembly that I want to point out. If, for whatever reason, you were changing the shifter pawl here, this is a locator pin that positions the spring that holds the pawl. If you had a broken return spring here and say your shifter just flopping around, this bolt here would be removed. Then you pull your shifter pawl out here, and then that allows you to replace that spring, put this back in, put that bolt back in, and now you're good there. Or if you were replacing this spring on the pawl itself, then same way, same process to remove that, replace that spring, slide that back together. And the second thing, and then that's obviously going to take your shaft out here. This shaft is in very good condition. I can see in there it's not worn. It wasn't leaking previously, so I'm going to say the shaft isn't damaged at all, and the splines themselves look good. This is a great opportunity for you to inspect the shift lever itself and then look at these splines. Okay, there's a reason that that shift lever is aluminum. The idea is for it to be a sacrificial material. So if your bolt here ever loosened up, then it would actually damage that aluminum shift lever before it would damage the steel shaft that's here. So that's actually a good design. There is an upgrade where you can put a steel lever here, but I typically don't do that for that reason. You know, I want to preserve these splines, because if you stripped these, we would have to do all of that just for that. So I'd rather have that sacrificial part in there. One other thing I want to show you is this little puck right here. This is your counter shaft bearing, and I'll talk about that here in just a second. That wraps up the disassembly, and in reality, putting it back together is, for the most part, exactly the reverse of what you just saw me do. Now, I mentioned that counter shaft bearing. I played around with trying to figure out how to get it all on camera, replacing that counter shaft bearing I referred to there, how to get it on camera, because I'm working kind of on both sides of the transmission with the tool required to remove that counter shaft bearing and reinstall it. And I really couldn't get a good camera angle. But like I mentioned before, if you go back and look at the 2 or 3 videos I did on rebuilding a cruise drive transmission, you will see me using that tool, removing that counter shaft, reinstalling it. The other thing you'll see is the teardown of the gear set. I went through each individual gear, also went through all the dog rings and everything else and how to inspect it and all that. So if you guys want to see how to fully rebuild one on the bench, then you can go back and refer to that video. Guys, thanks again for watching. I hope you enjoyed this and this gave you some insight and a few little tips and tricks to make your life easier. You know, sometimes damage can be done during disassembly, and geez, man, as many transmissions as I've torn apart all these years, you know, little tools, little things, you take your time and do no harm, I guess, and save yourself some headaches. Take care of yourselves and each other. We'll see you guys again soon. Have a good one.